Kia ora. Where do you store random objects of potential practicality? The batteries, plasters and paper clips you accumulate in life. This podcast is pretty much that place. You have opened the audio drawer. Here we're hoarding recordings for New Zealand Baptists, because one day this episode could be just the thing. What does it mean to be the church, and how are we modelling power? How does Jesus demonstrate power? This episode is a recording taken from Carey Conversations, Church and Leadership in Aotearoa Today. Jonny Weir, Director of Ministry Training at Carey Baptist College, interviews Frank Ritchie, Wesleyan Methodist Minister and one of the authors of the Arise Church report. They explore potential problems with models of church and leadership being adopted today. Joining the discussion from Carey Baptist College is Luke Kaa-Morgan, Te Pouarataki mō te hikoi, Christa McKirland, lecturer in Systematic Theology, and Michael Rhodes, Old Testament lecturer.
And our special guest tonight, Frank, do you want to just quickly introduce yourself?
My name is Frank Ritchie. I do a number of things. I'm a Carey graduate, so it's a real privilege to be part of this conversation. I'm a big fan of Carey and everything that Carey does. Carey did a really good job in my mind, not probably in some other people's minds, in setting me up for what it is that I do. I engage heavily in the public space. I'm a chaplain to people who work in New Zealand's media. I have a radio show on New Zealand's largest commercial radio network, News Talk ZB. I have a little show every Sunday evening from 6 till 7:30. It is life-changing. If you tune in, you will not be the same afterwards. It should have won awards, but it hasn't. They don't know what they're missing out on. I think it's because we're just ahead of our time, just like Christa at the moment. And I also run a small church here in Aotearoa, Hamilton, called Commoners. It's a quiet, contemplative little congregation.
Awesome, Frank. Thanks for coming in. Really appreciate it. Let's you and I chat for a moment. And can I start by saying, I do want to say thank you very much for the difficult but important work you are currently very much involved and engaged in to help us understand our responsibilities, I guess, as Christians, our responsibility to listen, to reflect, and to learn how to respond to these stories that are ever more frequent of brave women and men who are telling us some difficult truths about church and leadership, difficult to hear. And it's important work you're doing, Frank. So thank you very much. Not only thank you for being here tonight, but thank you more broadly for the effort you're putting in to help us in this space.
Yeah, thank you. Just to acknowledge that I'm a layman and I have a platform. So I speak because I know that I have a platform. With that platform comes responsibility. And as someone who is an ordained minister in the Wesleyan Methodist Church of New Zealand, I've made commitments when it comes to the church. I've dedicated my life to the service of the church, and particularly the church in the public square. But I do so very much as someone who's not really an expert. So I stand on the shoulders of giants. When I think about the giants, I'm thinking about people who were my lecturers at Carey. I'm thinking about the academics that I read. I'm thinking about the people who are on this panel. So I very much come at it as a generalist. But for those who are tuned into this, you have the privilege of having some people here who are way more than generalists. They are experts on these topics. So I'm really looking forward to how the wider panel discussion after this as well.
Yeah, well, a generalist, but among other things, a pastor as well. And I think when it comes to it, it's that grounded reality of life in church and in leadership that also is of immense value to us in this conversation. Frank, it's sadly the stories of toxic church and leadership that bring us to this conversation today. And I guess the goal of tonight, and you and I talked about this the other day, is to live and sit amongst the tension between these painful stories of the brave and the hopeful vision of what the scriptures, rightly understood and practiced, can offer us. So we want to hold that kind of balance of those two realities and the tension and that we sit with that. Can I ask you, just to kick this off, why do you think this is such an essential thing for us? Or if I can ask it another way, why in this moment do you think God might be speaking to us?
Yeah, I think it's really good that you've asked the question like that, that the possibility that God is speaking to us. I think we find ourselves in a moment. And I want to hold the image of an icon front and center for us as we continue this discussion. I'm a massive fan of the Eastern Orthodox icon of the harrowing of Hades, where it's a wonderful image for Easter Saturday in Orthodoxy, where Jesus has descended into Hades, and the story goes that Satan thinks he's won, and Jesus raids the whole place. And the wonderful icon has Jesus standing on the gates of Hades, and Satan is laying under those doors, and Jesus is grabbing Adam and Eve up out of their tombs, and everybody else is kind of following after them. When Jesus and his disciples were at Caesarea Philippi, there's that wonderful moment where Jesus' messiahship is declared by Peter. And Jesus makes an affirmation about this church. On this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. The church is this little enclave, and the gates of Hades are pressing against it, but we will hold out. Whereas I see the church as wonderfully victorious, that the gates of Hades won't hold out against the church, that the church will raid Hades just as Jesus did. So I want us to hold that picture first. Very hopeful picture of the nature of the church, and that the church is God's. But because I believe the church is God's, I see this time we're going through as God shaking his church. I think over the last number of, hundreds of years, we've gotten very used to having power, being in power, holding the cultural narrative, and the cultural narrative somewhat being determined by us. Over the last number of decades in New Zealand in particular, that has eroded. We find ourselves in a much more pluralist society where various worldviews are in play, and people on a more individual basis are working out their thoughts around spirituality. But when I look at the church, we still hold, many of us, this cultural assumption that we have power, or that we should have power, and that we should be listened to. And I don't think that's the case. So I think God is looking at his church in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and globally as well, and going, what does the church need to be? What does my church need to be for the next few hundred years? We think very short term, but God thinks in the long term. So I think he's going, what does it need to be for the next few hundred years? And we're in a bit of a shock moment where I think we're being caused to take a look at that ourselves. So I think the pandemic revealed a whole bunch of stuff when I think about the divisions in churches and some of the theology that came to the fore. And then I think about the recent stories of hurt in the church. And many of us know those stories have been there for a very long time. This is stuff that I've been talking about for 20 years. I remember my early days in Talkback on Life FM and hearing people's stories. This stuff isn't new, but it's about time that it came into the light. So we're having an opportunity now to have these sort of discussions, to acknowledge those who have been broken in our church spaces, and to rectify that and do something about it.
Okay, well, thank you for that start. You mentioned a couple of things in there, Luke, Frank, that I'm keen to pick up on. One of the things the big thing you talk about is the church, that Jesus says the gates of Hades will not prevail. Can I quote you? And I've actually got a quote here in front of me that you wrote in a blog recently. You said, it is my opinion within the context of the Christian community that the public allegations that we are experiencing raise issues that need to be addressed from a biblical perspective. And that perspective needs to consider the theological nature of the church. What are you driving at there?
I think in a number of our churches, and I think about churches that I've grown up in, I think our churches have been very influenced by the culture around us. And I'm particularly thinking the economic culture. And I raised this in another article recently, that the Industrial Revolution put front and center the idea of economic growth. So if you look around our world is driven now by the idea of economic growth. Everything needs to grow all the time. Health looks like growth. That success and health are about growth. And so then we've developed a whole lot of practices, and we've taken on a whole lot of things that are about growing our churches, making good organizations operate. I do not think that's a biblical image of the church. It's not that those practices aren't good, and it's not that they don't have a place in the church, but I don't think it's primarily what the church is. And I think we can look at a number of the issues that we're facing at the moment, a number of the ways people have got hurt. And I think we can trace it back to some of those things that we're doing that are probably more reflective of business economic growth than what it means to be the church. When I look at scripture, I see the church primarily as a family, primarily as a community that has decided to follow the way of Jesus and to be transformed in the way of Jesus, to be disciples and to be taught to obey what it is that Jesus has taught us about how we live in the world. That's primarily what we are. That's primarily what we do. And when we lose sight of that, I think damage occurs.
I'm interested, you mentioned some of the characteristics then that come from this kind of borrowed and mistaken identity that the church is starting to form itself in. I've got 3 words here that I'm keen for you to pick one of them just to riff off, okay? Related to that. And these come from your own writing. Corporatization, performance, and homogeneity. Do you want to pick one of those and have a go?
Yeah, let's take the corporatization of the church, because I think there's an element there where that influences who we hire and how we train, what we prioritize and the type of people that we're hiring. So if we view the church as a corporate entity that's taking on corporate structure and wants to grow according to business principles, and we can say that's all in the service of the kingdom, and I totally get that, but I actually think it needs to be challenged, because what we'll end up doing is we'll hire accordingly. There's a wonderful book that I'd encourage people here to read called A Church Called Tov by Scott McKnight and Laura Barringer. And it goes into the downfall of Bill Hybels and some of the issues that Willow Creek was having. And in there, it gives a job description for who should come after Bill, the initial job description. There's no mention of Jesus in it. There's no mention of theology. There's no mention of spiritual formation, spiritual disciplines, nothing. It's all about having to have had experience in growing organizations, growing large organizations, managing people. So if you want to grow an organization, you're going to hire primarily for that. The difficulty is if you hire for that with your senior pastor, and your senior pastor is the one who's going to occupy the pulpit the most, then you've got to start asking questions about what's going to get preached from the pulpit. How deep is that really going to go if their expertise is corporate leadership? And I think this is going to sound really cynical, but I think what you'll end up being left with is how to live your best life now, how to have good marriages, how to lead good businesses. None of that's bad, but it's not primarily what it means to follow Jesus. Of course, corporatization too. If you're wanting to grow organizations, your budget becomes key. And then people start to see the idea of giving in the church community as giving to increase the success of the organization. Whereas if we look at the New Testament, what we see going on with giving is a mutual support. There's a support between churches going on, there's support between individuals going on, and there's the support for the poor and the community around the church as well. So those are 2 examples of where I think corporatization causes some issues.
Awesome. Okay, that's really helpful. And the rest of the panel, I hope you're thinking how you might riff off some of this. And also, if you want to pick up on the word performance later on or homogeneity, feel free to do that. Frank, there's another word that you used when you had your initial comment about Jesus building his church, and that was the word power. I want to quote you again, if I may. You say in a recent blog post, wherever power is exercised between people, there is a possible danger of damaging people. All churches, as history teaches us, face the possible danger of damaging people through power. How can we understand the issue of pastoral leadership and power?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Henry Nouwen in this space. I'm a big fan of his very little book, In the Name of Jesus, which talks about leadership and some of the dangers of leadership, some of the temptations that those in leadership face. Also his book, The Wounded Healer. I do supervision for a couple of young ministers, and if anybody ever comes to me and they want some sort of ongoing relationship, it's a prerequisite that they have to read In the Name of Jesus. If you're not willing to read that, we're not going to have this relationship. But when you think about the Christian faith in almost every facet is the giving up of power. Whereas we live in a world that wants to pursue power. You gain influence, you can do things if you have power, if you're able to exercise power in some way. And I'm looking forward later to Christa feeding into this in some way as well, and discussions around authority. But the Christian faith, on the other hand, gives up power everywhere. If you think about the primary icon of the Christian church being the cross, this is the symbol of Jesus. First, the symbol of the incarnation is Christ giving up power and coming to earth in the form of a helpless little baby. That's this little flesh tube that anybody could have done away with. And then you see him empowering those, lifting up those who are weak. You see the example of him washing his disciples' feet, the giving of bread as his body and wine as his blood, going to the cross. At every point, you get that wonderful poem from Paul in Philippians about Jesus emptying himself of power. And I think we can look through history and see almost every instance where Christians have run the antithesis of that. It's turned into a nightmare. So leadership in the Christian sense is about the giving up of power rather than the pursuit of power. And I think you can trace almost every problem in the Christian church to the pursuit of power.
Let me ask then a brief question. Charisma first or character?
Oh, definitely character. Now, this is really hard because I think I'm quite a charismatic person, but definitely character. But because we've prioritized the growth of churches, putting people in seats so that they'll give their life to Jesus and pray this in his prayer, we'll generally again hire and put in places of significance people who can put the bums in the seats and get the hands raised, and then we'll sideline a whole bunch of stuff or we'll let a whole bunch of stuff go because they get that job done. But if spiritual formation, discipleship, and spiritual disciplines are the center of what leadership is about, forming people in the way of Jesus, then their character becomes central, way more than how they can act when they've got a microphone in front of them.
I want to move into that question then now, if we can develop that, Frank. But we also want to hear from Michael in a minute. Michael, power and authority, so often we hear in terms of leadership, the Old Testament come into play as key for understanding models of leadership. So when we get a chance to hear from you later, I'm keen to hear you reflect also on how you understand power and authority and leadership, particularly from Old Testament models. But just one more with you, Frank, before we throw it open to our panel. So you've just started to segue into the idea of spiritual formation and under, character of a leader. I'm going to give you one more quote from you. I'll throw these words back to you. And if you can explore these with us. You say, since the church is a community being formed by the way of Jesus into Christ-likeness, depth of theological understanding and a strong commitment to spiritual formation should be essential characteristics of those leaders tasked with guiding the community. What are you on about there?
First, I'd just like to say I totally agree with myself. It's quite good. In the time that we find ourselves in, I occupy a really interesting space. As someone who's most of what I do is spiritual conversations with people who do not have a Christian faith. As a chaplain, I sit down with people almost to a T. They want to have spiritual conversations. So I get to hear what it is that they're questioning. From some lady who told me about the voodoo shrine in her house, to another one who told me about his sister who sees dead people and can predict when people are going to die, to another one who thought the Holy Spirit was this white thing that floats around. These people, our nation is craving for spiritual conversation, but I don't think we've equipped our people for those spiritual conversations. We've seen evangelism as often quite formulaic. It's the need to convey a whole bunch of ideas and get this other person to believe those ideas. But I think the church of now and the church of the future in Aotearoa, New Zealand, needs to be confident. Our people need to be confident in whatever space they find themselves in to have spiritual conversations with people. And there's no formula for that. What that demands of us is that we are close to the Spirit of God, that we are being formed by the Spirit of God so that we can connect with what God is already doing in the world around us. And Acts 17 with Paul in Athens is almost my modus operandi. That passage has had a huge influence on how I operate. So we need people being formed well, not being formed on the internet, not being formed by YouTube and other voices, not being formed by the Left Behind series, but being formed by good theology, which is why I think Carey is so important. It's also why we need some confidence from our ministers who have been trained, because often there's a gap between the theology of the people who have been trained and are leading churches, and then the theology of the people sitting in the pews. And often we don't go there to challenge some stuff that's sitting in the pews because we're scared that those people are going to walk away or that they're going to cause issues. So I think we need some confidence from our leaders who have been trained in some of our institutions as well.
Frank, I sometimes get asked, because my role here at Carey is to train pastors, and I sometimes get asked by people, does a pastor need to have theological training? Can you help me formulate an answer to that?
Yes, but it comes back to a good understanding of what the church is. So if the church is about growing an organization, you don't need theological training for that. But if church is a community of people who have dedicated their life to following Jesus and being formed in the way of Jesus, then we need leaders who are well and truly steeped in understanding Jesus and understanding the scriptures and understanding how people are formed. And that happens at our theological colleges. Sure, you can learn a thing or two by picking up books, but you really need the tools for analyzing all that stuff and for analyzing the culture around us and how we fit as well.
That is a brilliant segue. I can hear knocking at our door, Frank, 3 of our guests that want to come in and have a chat, all who happen to teach in a theological college. So it's about time, Michael, Luke, and Christa, maybe we can hear from you, and you can all, between the 4 of you, begin a conversation. But let me just give you a few moments each to share your initial reflections. Let's start with you, Luke. Do you want to respond to anything Frank said, or is there anything you'd like to add to this conversation initially as you come into it?
Yeah, I feel so warmly towards the nature of the kōrero, because I think of the last 40 years of my engagement with leadership in our churches, and I realise as Māori that we have a certain perspective and certain experiences, encounters with power. We've had any varied expressions, but particularly to do with our identity and our place and space in the room that is created there. I think I see church like a sustainable hui or wānanga. I think that it's fundamentally about whanaungatanga and whakawhanaungatanga. It's about making relational connections as we are making our relational connection with the Lord. I think the sadness of some of our historical expression as Māori in the church is someone else had the power to be able to inform the narrative about what is clean and unclean from our Māori spirituality, what is good, what is evil, what is black, what is white, what is wrong, what is right. And we're still actually probably negotiating the handover of that power for that narrative to begin to be explored. I would say it's still foreign for Māori to be in charge of the narrative, to be able to inform our wider communities of faith of what we would say is included within spirituality, and that we have yet to be able to confront some of the power holders to speak truth into that space. But I think we're being equipped, that we've got some really fantastic conversations that are going on. But I think the sadness of our history is that we've got many disillusioned Māori across the country with whom have had encounters with church and walked away extremely disappointed, possibly as a reality of a confrontation with power, possibly as a reality of actually not being accepted in the true reality of our identity and all that encompasses, and having others decide what was right and wrong in our identity. That's kind of a very broad perspective, but I think we're in a season of shift and change. And Frank, actually, I heard you speak recently at the Justice Conference that TF Fund hosted, and there was a spontaneous moment that it would stick out to me. But I heard the nature of what you believe a place of Māori and Māori leadership within our Christian family would be important for this way. And I absolutely believe that that's key for the context of Aotearoa as we're looking at our church, and particularly as we're looking at moving into a greater sense of health and flourishing as faith communities. That's my current thought.
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Can I just quickly respond to that, Jonny? Because I think what Luke has said is fantastic, and I do want to reiterate the point that he's made in regards to something that I said at the Justice Conference, and I just haven't raised it here. I think the future of Christian faith in New Zealand is going to be led by Māori. I think us, especially us white Pākehā males, I think are going to need to step off the stage and allow them to own it. Partly because I think there's an indigenous faith that is of this land, and I think the Holy Spirit has been doing something right from the beginning in this place. I also think Māori are better equipped to engage in the spiritual conversations that our nation is desperate to have, where I think the much more materialist understanding, dualistic understanding of the faith that comes from a more Pākehā way of seeing things is not as well equipped. So I think Māori have a very special place there. And I also think too, because I work from the worldview that says that the Holy Spirit is at work everywhere all the time, it's our job to help people connect the dots. I'd love to know how Aotearoa would have looked different if the early missionaries had been way more informed by Acts 17 and had come in and gone, where is God already at work here? What is the Spirit already doing? And how do we partner with that? How do we uphold that? How do we lift that up and serve these people? And I think they would have seen something quite wonderful. As with all cultures, there are no doubt changes probably needed to take place in areas, but I think the Spirit was well and truly at work here if you had eyes to see and ears to hear.
Awesome. Ka pai, Luke, thank you, and Frank. Christa, as we're continuing to add morsels to the table for discussion, is there anything that you want to respond to or add to the table?
Oh, I've taken a lot of notes. I'm loving this theme of family. And some of the contrasts that have already been coming up, the things that come to mind is that we have not an organization, but an organism, not a business, but a family. And also mixed into that is not Christendom, but Christianity. And so each of those, I think we are in a shifting state right now where people are wanting more than what, how you frame some of this, Frank, how the church has been historically done in this land. And honestly, I've grown up in Georgia, I've gone to church in California, I've gone to church in Scotland, and I've come here, and it's the same thing. And it shouldn't be the same thing, because those are four very different places. And so how do we, I think, kind of get back to what some of these principles from the New Testament. I'm really excited to hear what Michael has to say about the Old as well. But the most prominent metaphor for the church in the New Testament is family. So what Luke was saying, this whakawhanaungatonga, like that is actually part of our DNA. And so, yeah, I'm keen to continue that conversation around how sibling relationships work, because it's not even the father. It's obviously the God as father over the family, but within the family itself, it's sibling relationships. And those, when it comes to power dynamics, were the least influenced by the power dynamics of relationships during that ancient context. And that's the framework, the most prolific framework we have for talking about the church. And so that then inflects how we think about authority and power. And so I'll hold off on that conversation maybe for a little bit later in our discussion together, because Michael had some really helpful insights on his definition of power that I found really helpful. So I don't want to steal any of his thunder. But I've seen a few chats come up. I know that's going to come up later, but it's had a thought for me of one metric, I think, for asking in our church communities, is this a flourishing community? And as Baptists, that for me, I'm thinking from a Baptist perspective, because this might look differently in other denominational settings. But speaking from that lens, if someone were to visit your church community and then leave after your Sunday time or whenever y'all meet, who would they say was the head of that gathering? Who would they say was in charge of that gathering? And my guess, for most churches, it's going to be the paid professional. It's not going to be the Spirit of the risen Lord. It's not going to be Jesus Christ. It's not going to be the body collectively discerning that mind of Christ. So for me, and again, we can say, oh, that's just idealistic and Pollyannish. I don't think it is. I do think it is possible on this side of the eschaton. But as Frank has highlighted, we have heaps of entanglements that can prohibit us from moving in that direction. And so the last thing on that I want to say is, because we've moved more into this business model and what we've talked about from Frank with the organization model, what I've found is, I think the economics, the fiduciary components, the finances, they've actually become the driver in our churches, and they are inhibiting our prophetic witness. So we are afraid of saying some things and being radical disciples because we're going to lose people who are in our communities. And we're not going to lose them out of the kingdom of God. That's in God's hands. They're going to go to another church, but they're not going to be contributing to our coffers and paying our bills. And so that's one thing that keeps me up at night, is, have we let the tail wag the dog? And I do think we will be held to account for that.
So much to chew on there. And Christopher, if I could just underline what I think I heard you saying, the New Testament frequent use of language like brother and sister is not merely about being affectionate to each other. It is actually a theological category that flattens
there's
our authority structures.
A whole theology of the church as family. If people are interested in that, I'd recommend Joseph Hellerman's book on this, but talking about how this is radical in a context where people's whole identities were wrapped up in their blood lineage. And so what Jesus is inaugurating, first, he's our firstborn among many brothers and sisters. He is the one who has to be risen from the dead so that we can then be adopted into the family and become first, or the second and third borns after him. So our family, our being grafted into the family of God, is because of our relation to Jesus, who is the Son by nature, so that we might be sons and daughters by grace. And so then he does this. Jesus is radically offensive. So you think of examples where, the guy says, I need to go bury my dad. I want to follow you, but I got to go bury my dad. And Jesus says, let the dead bury their dead. I mean, that was caustic, especially when that would have been that son's responsibility to take care of his father's funeral components. So things like that, or the woman that cries out, blessed are the breasts that nursed you and the hands that held you. And Jesus says, no, blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and do it. So I think one thing he's addressing where women got their value, which was from producing not just children, but sons. And so she was recognizing that his mama would have gotten honor in that context because of having a son who was of renown. And he is subverting that paradigm and saying that's not where your value comes from, in this idea of this blood relationship, passing that on and distributing power through your bloodline. And he's reforming what it means to be family. And so that is replete in the New Testament. And that's where the lowest power, or I guess you'd have the lowest power differentials would have existed, would be between brothers and sisters and brothers and brothers and sisters and sisters.
There you go, a theology of the church. Thank you, Christa. Michael, can I bring you in? And is there anything you'd like to add or respond to at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I want to thank everybody who's said stuff so far. I've already learned a ton. Frank, that devastating story about the job description, I mean, we could just stop there and go home and repent, I think. And Luke, I love you bringing attention to the way that power has been misused to the detriment of spirituality of all sorts in this place. And Christa, that I want to go home and mull on that. I don't need to go home. I'm home now. I want to get off this call and mull over those family metaphors. Speaking from an Old Testament perspective, I do want to talk a little bit about power. And I think that it might be a little bit of a pushback, but I think that there's no doubt in my mind that the Bible from beginning to end would be completely appalled by the concentration and misuse of power in our churches. And having said that, I think solving that problem, though, requires us to reclaim a positive vision of power and really agency. You don't need the Bible to get at this, because if power is bad, giving power to another person is unloving. If power is poison, you don't give poison to your neighbor. So we actually want, when people are powerless, for them to have more power. And so that suggests that there is something normative and positive and good about agency, about a certain kind of power. And I think that, so what does the Old Testament say about that? I think it starts by saying that humans have that agency and power because they're created in God's image. So the very first thing we hear about people is that they're made to look like God, and they're made in God's image. I think the translation of Genesis 1 there is that they may rule, right? And so being made in the image of God, part of the vocation is to exercise agency, influence in the world. And we very quickly learn from Genesis 2 some things about the nature of that rule, namely that it's for care and cultivation and service, not for dominance and exploitation. It is the kind of power that we see God exercising in Genesis 1 and 2, that's creative, that's even participatory. I wish we had time to talk about that, but God's power, even in Genesis 1, is participatory. He says, let the earth bring forth, and the earth brings forth. So God brings the animals to Adam to see what he'll name them, and he names them, and that's their name. So there's this vision of a positive agency and power that is humanity's birthright. And uniquely in the ancient world, it's every male and female birthright. There's no ancient Near Eastern text that calls women the image of God specifically outside of Genesis. So it's a really strong statement about the possible good of power that is broadly distributed and that is oriented towards care and cultivation. And in a world that's gone wrong, that power is increasingly identified as appropriate when it's exercised on behalf of the poor. So the best definition of justice in the Old Testament is the faithful exercise of power in community. And the faithful exercise of power in community is always on behalf of the poor and the marginalized in the Old Testament. It's Job smashing the teeth of the wicked. It's the king endowed with justice in Psalm 72 to lift up the lowly. So you get this sense of power broadly distributed and a positive good under certain situations. But the other thing I want to say is, sort of in complete agreement with what Frank's saying, the Old Testament has this really realistic view that power in our world so often goes off the rails. And what's really fascinating here, Jonny, talked about how so often kind of the royal thing gets picked up in big, powerful churches. Maybe the royal theological image is used to back up the corporate CEO image. And what's interesting about that is that when God originally arranges his society and economy, no king. Go read Genesis through Deuteronomy. God sets up his society, no monarch. Why? Because he wants power broadly distributed, including economic power broadly distributed through every family having a plot in the land, because a plot in the promised land represents the necessary economic component and ecological component for people to exercise power and agency alongside their brothers and sisters and for the good of their neighbors. And what's intriguing is that when you get so it's not that, you know, that goes off the rails as well, because in the book of Judges, people are abusing their power in all sorts of horrible ways. So it's not a utopian wonderland in the village society of the Old Testament, but the monarchy that we so celebrate really is actually problematic in the Old Testament. Exodus through Deuteronomy doesn't really have a king. When the people ask for a king in 1 Samuel, God is angry about it and says, this is a rejection of me. And while we celebrate David as the anointed king, and God does make powerful commitments to David and work through him, that fully the second half of the David story is about his abuse of power and subsequent downfall, such that the book of 2 Samuel ends with David broken, seeing the people dying from a plague that he caused by his disobedience, and saying to the Lord, oh, take me and my family, these sheep are innocent. Right? So power with the kings goes way off the rails. And I think what's really interesting, so any kind of baptizing of our power structures with reference to the monarchy is really bizarre from the Old Testament's perspective. But I'll just say this, and then we can keep talking. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, do have one passage that allows for a king. And it's Deuteronomy 17. And in that passage, God's kind of set up no king, yet judges and prophets and priests and all this. And they kind of have, separate power. But then God says, okay, if you want a king, fine, you can have a king. Here are the parameters. I choose him. He can't amass gold. He can't amass weapons. He can't amass wives, which is like saying to the president of the United States, it's fine for you to be president, but you can't live in the White House. You don't get the nuclear codes, and you can't veto the bills. And every president will be like, well, why bother signing up? Right? And that's what anybody campaigning to be king in Israel would say when they hear Deuteronomy 17. What's he supposed to do with all of his time? This is what he's supposed to do. He can write the law, which is the book of Deuteronomy in this case, write his own copy and meditate on it day and night. The law that enshrines care of the immigrant, care of the widow, the surrender of power for the sake of the neighbor, the broad distribution of economic resources on the Jew. That's what the king, that's the only thing the king's allowed to do. He's allowed to be the chief adherent of God's way in the world. So wherever there are differences in power in any kind of appropriate sense, that power is never for amassing like honor and status and control. It's the people who are most committed to the Torah way, which, to echo Frank, ends up being the Jesus way. So I think there's really remarkable resources in the Old Testament for thinking about how you move from these horrible abusive power concentrations to something that looks more like the family Christa is talking about, while recognizing the created good of agency and that form of power in the world.
Wow. Okay. There's a whole lot being delivered up there. I'm keen for the 4 of you to talk together for maybe 12 minutes or so before we go to some questions. I'm going to be sorting out some questions which are replete on my chat here. So are you happy to chat with each other about what you've all been talking about and see where that goes? And then I'm going to come in with some very specific questions after a little while. Is that okay?
Sounds great. Since I've got a thought on the heels of Michael's, can I share that?
Yeah, you just all go for it. I've lost control at this point.
Oh, great. Yeah, so I love that, Michael, this idea of power as agency. And I think one of the things we do, and one of the symptom or the issues I see undergirding a lot of the things we're talking about tonight, things Frank's raised in his context, is the conflation of power with authority over. So I feel like those two things get married. And just to read Matthew 20:25 and following, Jesus called his disciples together and said to them, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And I think summarizing what we've been talking about with the Torah and the Jesus way, it's Jesus and Philippians 2, right? That idea that Jesus does not consider equality with God something to be leveraged to his own advantage. It's probably the best translation of harpagmon, the Greek there, of what is happening in Philippians 2, but instead submitted himself to death, and not just any old death, but a death on the cross, which Paul's writing to the Philippians. Philippians many of them are Roman citizens who couldn't die by crucifixion. They could die by beheading if it was a capital offense. And so for a Roman citizen to hear of the founder of their faith dying a gruesome death, not only did he become human, but also died that way on our behalf. And so what we see in Jesus, and I'm seeing some of these questions come up as well in the chat, is actually it's the embodiment of what we should be doing with power, which is leveraging that for the sake of others. And so it doesn't mean he didn't have power, but it's what he did with that. Now, granted, Jesus is also ontologically God. So there is a difference as well, right? Within the kind of authority Jesus can rightfully wield. So I'd want to say, yeah, Jesus gets to have authority over the church, and that preposition stands. When we turn to the rest of the New Covenant community, that is not the kind of relation that we see in play. Power as agency, the ways we've described that, yes. Authority over, I don't think we can get much more explicit than what Jesus says there. And then we don't have positive examples of that. So I think we need to disentangle power, which is a part of leadership, godly leadership, but that is not the same thing as authority over, which has business trappings in there too. I tell you what to do, you do it, or you're fired, or you're out, or whatever. There's consequence if you don't do what I say. I don't think that is the model we see in the New Testament.
Can I just, I've got to interrupt. Can you help me then, or not, Crystal, whoever help me? Michael, Old Testament reference. What if I'm sitting in a church and the vibe I'm getting from the leadership or from the stage is that for some reason or another, it's appropriate for me not to touch the Lord's anointed or to honor those whom God has put over me, or, you know, like finish whatever version of that sentence where there's a sense in which in some way there is an anointed group within the group that we all defer to, and we're challenging God to some degree or another if we challenge them. Someone talk to me about that.
Christy, you want to talk about that?
Well, I'm trying to understand, like, are you saying like this, like a team of elders? Like, I'm trying to just visualize what you mean here, Jonny.
I'm visualizing the context where leadership is positioned in a congregation in a way that it feels scary to challenge them for whatever reason.
Oh.
Often biblical verses are used to do that.
Yeah, I have some serious concern with that. Because that's just not what you see. Like it's the body metaphor, right? Like every part is needed in that. And if you have, so this would be another metric. This would be a metric, I think, of toxicity, is if you cannot ask questions or challenge those in leadership in a healthy way, right? In a relational way, like to question those in leadership. If you can't do that in your church context, I'd say that's an unhealthy church leadership model. And that would need, I think, would need to be challenged. I don't know what that would look like, but that to me is a metric of toxicity.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that there is a lot of teaching in the Bible, including the New Testament, about respecting people who are in leadership and specific instances of service. And I'm maybe sensitive to this because we just had a student do a remarkable integrative project on pastors getting beat up by their congregations a bit. So I do think there is such a thing as honoring and respecting leaders. And I think a lot of cultures know this better than we white American types about what actual respective leadership looks like. But this idea that leaders are above criticism or that they can't be challenged or whatever. I mean, Paul is the least of the apostles, and yet he confronts Peter to his face on the carpet in front of his peers for his racially segregated eating practices. Right? So there's nobody with more power in the early church, and from a human perspective, than Peter. And Paul feels quite fine confronting him. And from an Old Testament perspective, I mean, the whole Old Testament is basically like throwing shade on the Old Testament's heroes. Like if you, I keep talking about David because we just spent a semester studying him in our biblical narrative class. But if you take from go to the stuff about David with the assumption David's God's man, so he's untouchable, and then read from the beginning to end of 1st and 2nd Samuel, I mean, the whole thing is like constantly criticizing David. The famous ones like Nathan, the prophet, but also there are all these women in 1st and 2nd Samuel who are constantly pushing back on David and calling him to account. And David acknowledges, if it hadn't been for Abigail, for instance, I would have committed unjust bloodshed against my neighbor. I needed to be confronted by this woman. The entire existence of the writing prophets, so like the big chunk at the end that you avoid from Isaiah to Malachi, exists in large part because somebody had to call out the kings. And so those people were called prophets. So I think that kind of sacrosanct approach to leadership is it's unbiblical from start to finish. I just can't let it go without pointing out that radical thing that Christa pointed out about like, don't lord it over the Gentiles. In case you missed it, Jesus was just thinking about Deuteronomy. Right? Like all the way back in Deuteronomy. You know how to do kings? Can't do any of that. If you want to be a king, can't be a king like the nations. Has to be a king who serves, right? So that's a consistent thread all the way through.
Can I just make a comment about the servant leadership? Because I think it's easy for us, and I know this will be in our thoughts, that it's been easy to look across at a Pentecostal situation, for example, and go, we are so grateful we're not like them. And particularly for those of us who have engaged in our family of churches that have really gone out for servant leadership. So I'm a Baptist pastor, and we have many times prided ourselves on being servant leadership. And in our Baptist context, we're up for grabs when it comes to pushback on leadership, usually. However, I'm also in an experience where we've had minorities that have, in the end, butted up against power that is pretty solid. And I think the idea of the teaching of servant leadership made us feel like we absolutely don't have a love relationship with power. But I think we would find in our family of churches many, many people who have experienced the exact opposite of that. I think we are always wanting to be careful of the way we would judge in other situations, but I think we have judged sometimes carelessly, and in the middle of our spaces, we've actually accommodated the very thing that we find abhorrent. And so when Jonny, when you asked us about touching the anointed, etc., those dynamics, I think we've also entertained versions of that, and we've got some very sad stories that we would really want to revisit and not continue to work out in our context. I think that many pastoral people have discovered that there's an unhealthy association with power. I think that's just my peers. I think over and over again, we have experienced there is a measure of a lack of health with that. And in many of our spaces, we've found that we're not really working out biblically, because when we look, as you've pointed to in this, Frank and Christa and Michael, Jesus is the most beautiful example of who we just want to be as leaders, like gives us the absolute amazing example of the reality of what it actually means to be in leadership within his church. I guess that's a given for us. But when we read those scriptures and when we're hanging around in the Gospels, those are the exact examples that we should be embodying over and over again. But someone else should be telling us we're doing a really good job of that, or we need to be pushed back and challenged in that reality. Can I just say one other thing from our Māori world? I think we've got the most, Frank, you mentioned it from Acts 17, which culminates in a way to saying, in him we live and move and breathe and have our being. That puts the most incredible, has for years, the most incredible hope in me, because the presumption really with the coming of the gospel to Aotearoa is there is not one redeemable thing in what we would have discovered in the Great Migration, in setting up home and becoming Māori in the context of Aotearoa. And there were measures of evil and trouble, but it was not all that. And God had been discovered and found. And we don't get to revisit this, but the simple question that you posed before, where is God at work? Where's the fingerprint of God in the space? What are the things that you've learned today that we could be teaching many, many people from out of our world and out of our context? Power's pushed that back. And a misuse of power has silenced actually the work of God and the gift of God, the treasures of God. I think the beauty of us working together and being able to collaborate and be family together is going to be a real key. And that's going to take trust, because there's going to be many things that are unfamiliar to our current dominant culture within the life of the church. We can do it, but it's going to be different.
Can I make a comment to that, Luke? Yeah. I so appreciate you pointing out, hey, we in this camp might be looking over there and think it's their problem, and it's not. And nothing that I'm a Presbyterian minister myself, so we've got at least a Methodist, Presbyterian, and a bunch of Baptists up here on the panel. We come from different ecclesial traditions, different ways of fleshing out leadership. And in any of our camps, it can be easy to look and think that it's the structure that's the issue. Now, I think we need to be careful, because structures do contribute, right? And so thinking critically about structures is important. And we want to think about our ecclesial distinctives here. But one lesson I think we learned from the Bible is that abuse of power can happen in any of these institutions. You set up the village economy in Torah, you get the hellscape of the judges. You try to anoint a king after God's own heart, you get the hellscape of the fallout of the monarchy. You bring Nehemiah and his leaders back in after exile, they're still selling their brothers into slavery. You get Peter in the Jerusalem church, he won't eat with the Gentiles. You get the Corinthians worshiping in the spirit, they oppress the poor at the communion table. There's no model of the people of God organizing themselves in a way that prevents this problem. It's a constant militant spiritual battle. And Frank, your point about spiritual formation and character is so important. So anytime I, as a Presbyterian, or you, or wherever you are going, oh yeah, this is a problem of those people over there, I think we're on really shaky grounds. I really appreciate you for pointing that out, Luke. I just want to say a hearty amen to that.
But we have wondered about the Presbyterians, Michael.
I mean, we're the exception, of course. No problems here. Look somewhere else. Look over there. Look over there.
I tell you what, I'm going to go to some questions now. We've got a whole bunch of them, but let's just segue directly from what Michael and Luke just talked about. Frank, you mentioned Scott McKnight's a church called Tove, in which he defines the essence of spiritual formation, or a healthy church, as goodness. Nathan asks, what are some better indicators of church health, if you were to over against some of the indicators that we might normally look at what makes a good church? What are better indicators?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've been talking about that question around Christian Savings has been having its conference on governance around the country, and I've been answering some questions on this there. I think we're still formulating that, but I would say the fruit of the Spirit is a really good thing to look for in your congregation. And if we're doing what we do well, then people who are very different from each other should be gathering in our spaces. People who think about things very differently. They have different cultural experiences. Now, the bottom line is, when you put people who are very different from each other into various spaces, fallout is going to happen. And so when disagreement occurs, or when those differences are starting to play out, how they work those things out together is a really good indicator of how they're being formed in the way of Jesus. Is the fruit of the Spirit present when those disagreements are playing out? We have some values in my congregation. I can't remember what our vision statement is. I don't really care, but we have a set of values, and those values define who we are. Those values are worship, mission, simplicity, and hospitality. So looking at how those things are playing out in people's lives. Are they being hospitable in their life? Not just to other people in church, but in general. Because we're a relatively small congregation too, I can Facebook stalk all my people, so I can see how they're talking about faith. Some of them are sweary bears, and we need to have a conversation about that. But also just watching some of them get more confident in how they talk about faith too, when they've had burnt experiences in other churches and have gone very quiet. Just watching how they engage in the public square, I think, is a good marker too. I heard someone talking about going from measuring growth to measuring connection. So how are their people connecting together? There are a whole bunch of different things we could be measuring, but a lot of them are qualitative, not quantitative. Bums on seats is a really easy measure. The budget is an easy measure. This is a longer, harder journey that we're talking about here. When we talk about forming people, we're talking about years, not just this quarter.
Can I add something real fast on that too? Frank, in light of what you just said, and Jonny, also your question earlier about the Lord's anointed, it also raised the question of how did the Lord's anointed get there? So I think, and this brings in some structural questions. What are our processes for recognizing leadership within our communities? So the elder model, for instance, just using that kind of biblical category, I mean, it's in the name, right? It's people older in the faith. It's people that have earned influence in their context because people want to look like them. Why? Because they look like Jesus, fruit of the Spirit. There it is again. And so what you see, again, it's not that they don't have leadership and they're not exercising their agency in these Christ-like ways, but that it's not coming from a position of authority over. It's, hey, come follow me, come be led by me, but it's because I've been led by Jesus. And so I have questions even on our processes of how, like, what are our processes for selecting elders? What's the transparency there? What's the accessibility there? So another metric for me would be if you have the same set of elders for a decade, that actually I think is problematic, because how are you not raising up new older people in the faith who can serve in that kind of capacity? If you read the 1 Timothy 3, it's character qualifications for eldering, 19 of them. And there is one to be able to teach. And so like that leadering it's a character-based thing. And so I'm curious, like, I think there are some more radical ways that we could even select our eldering people, like even sending around slips of paper and saying, hey, I want you to write down 3 names from your community who are members or whatever the process is. Who is it in your community that looks like Jesus? Who do you see to the fruit of the Spirit in? Or whose shoulder would you cry on when you are grieving? Those kinds of questions. And you collect those and you could make a better discerning decision as a body of who could actually be eldering, because they're already doing it. And that's the pattern we also see in the New Testament. Paul, on his first missionary journey, isn't establishing elders. He's planting churches, but it's then the second missionary journey that he then just names what people were already doing. They were functioning as those who were mature in the faith. And so the constant exhortation in the New Testament is to move from immaturity to maturity. And it's those who are mature that we want to be leading in those spaces. So I've got a lot of questions about our transparency, about our access, about our closed door meetings, and how are we actually helping people? And this is another thing, business, going back to that. Our elders are often just really great business people. I'm sorry, I'm just going to name it. It's not because of their character. It's because they're the biggest tithers. And then it's elders for life. And I think that is so unhealthy. And so we hit these walls of how our churches can't keep moving forward, but it comes back to this chain of the fiduciary to our prophetic witness. So I'll stop. Sorry. I'll just keep going.
Can I say something about that? If we're going to talk about process, Ken, I saw your question about how the experience here of Mallory is of abuse of power, but also of knowing something of an appropriate kind of power interwoven in our culture, the whenua, the narratives. And I just want to say, if we're going to talk about structures that work, I personally feel like, us, I'll make it easy. Us Americans, what we do is we have the really steep pyramid, that's from a corporate model. And then we try to blow that up and we don't know what to do. And we talk about participatory decision-making, all this discernment, but we don't know how to do it. And my hunch is actually that, Luke, I would love to hear you speak to, are there processes within Te Ao Māori that are some of those goodnesses that were the work of God prior to the missionary arrival that we can actually use? Like when the Baptists got together, we talked about it as a hui. I don't know what a hui is. I've been here for like 15 minutes, but I'm thinking that that's reflective of the idea that there are resources that are held by the Tangata Whenua that I'd like to know more about if we're going to talk about processes.
Totally. We've got beautiful processes, and many people will be familiar in this forum with those. But I think the underlying ones, when we hui together, we take time to hear the voices. So there's an enormous amount of consultation that goes on in spaces. You look at the process of becoming family, of building relationship together, and that's fundamental to the spaces that we engage with. You would know the word manaaki or manaakitanga, and it's really to uphold another's mana. It's the giving of hospitality. It's the, obviously, kai. But there's all these dynamics that we're aware of in spaces where, a little bit like what Christa was saying, they're always like, who are the people there that you would allow to correct you, that would actually bring a word of admonition to you, that you would actually take seriously for your own growth, for your maturing, as well as the people that you're going to cry on their shoulder? Who are the people that do bear the fruit of the Spirit? And in family, in the nature of whānau, hapu, iwi, across the marae, all of that function, even in some situations where it's fallen to bits, people know where to go back to if we want to see things to be revived in our marae spaces. But the starting point is just simply relationship and taking each other seriously. It's about giving honor. It's about sharing honor amongst each other. It's about the voices. It's about the space where people feel safe and where they feel seen and where they're recognized. Just those things that humankind need, but function sometimes and usually very well in our marae spaces, which is why I get excited about the fact that we don't need a church building on a marae. We just need a group of people doing marae things and having moments of karakia and whakamoemiti together, and we'll find a group of people who can grow into maturity in those spaces. That's a thing.
Kia ora, Luke. Thank you all for your contributions. Frank, a final question of you, and it's a question that raises attention because many of us have read the Pathfinders report that you and others compiled to make recommendations as to how a Rise Church might work through and redress some of the challenges that they've faced. Someone has asked the question, Wendy's asked the question, and perhaps by necessity, much of that report felt like you were talking about structures and systems and processes that felt somewhat corporatized. And most of tonight's been about being a family. Have you got some response to that?
Yeah, I'd say there's another piece of work that goes somewhat alongside that report. So that report was very much about systems and processes in Arise. But there's another piece of writing which has been quoted here that I put together that was about the theological and biblical examination of it. So You can find that on my website, francis-ritchie.com. That piece of work kind of goes together with the other. So if you want a more theological examination of what went on there, I would highly suggest reading that. And you'll read the quotes that have been given tonight and a whole lot of my thinking around the issue. Before we close too, I just want to say, I don't know the experiences of the people who have tuned into this. I don't know what your experience has been in church life, but one thing that I've been very grateful for this year are the people who have had the courage to come forward and voice their experiences in church settings. That's not an easy thing to do. And I know that there are people in different parts of faith now because of those experiences. There are people who sadly have walked away from faith. There are people who are still well and truly entrenched in faith, but I am eternally grateful for those people who I consider to be well and truly part of the church, part of the body of Christ, who have raised their voice. And I think we all need to acknowledge them. We would not be having this conversation if those people had not had the courage to come forward. And in the same vein, I want to acknowledge Māori in New Zealand who have borne the brunt of the abuses of church here in Aotearoa as well now for far too long. And I think we're starting to see the courage of Māori coming forward and claiming their rightful place here in this nation. So my thanks go to the people who have raised their voice this year. And my thanks goes to Māori and the place that they're slowly taking here in Aotearoa as well.